During the severe winter of 1843, the upper Mississippi Valley experienced bitter cold, with settlers recording temperatures roughly 31 degrees Fahrenheit lower than almanac predictions. Inside a single-room log cabin near Fort Snelling, Minnesota, a family woke up to find frost covering the interior walls. Overnight, the fire had dwindled to glowing coals. Outside, the mercury dropped to negative 42 degrees Fahrenheit. In the total darkness, the father rose, brushed back a layer of ash from the hearth, and found what he needed. Under the gray ash, embers still emitted a crimson glow. He placed small twigs on the coals, revived the fire, and averted disaster. If the fire bank had failed, if there were no hot embers in the morning to reignite the flame, the family could freeze to death before help arrived. This was not rare, it happened frequently. Across the entire American frontier, from the Dakota Plains to the forests of the upper Midwest, settlers faced winters where survival depended on precise construction methods, relentless labor, and a willingness to learn from others. Often romanticized as a symbol of rugged independence, the log cabin was in fact a sophisticated thermal system. Its walls were not just stacked logs, they were carefully engineered barriers against wind, cold, and death. The people who built these cabins did not invent them. They adopted techniques refined over 5,000 years, brought across the ocean by immigrants who had survived similar winters in Scandinavia and Northern Europe. Russia. The question was not whether the log cabin would work in North America. It was whether the settlers could apply it well enough to survive through the night. The log cabin first appeared in North America in 1638, brought by Swedish and Finnish settlers along the Delaware River. These immigrants came from regions where winter temperatures regularly fell below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, where timber was abundant, and where survival depended on speed and heat conservation. They brought a building method that had been tested for millennia. Archaeological evidence shows that log construction started in the Bronze Age, around 3,500 BC, in the forests of Scandinavia and northern Russia. By the time it reached the American frontier, it was no longer experimental. It was proven knowledge. The advantage was speed. A skilled team of Finnish or Swedish builders could raise a cabin in a single day using only axes. No nails or complex joinery were used, just logs with corner notches that interlocked to hold the structure together. This quick construction was vital in a place where winter could arrive suddenly, and shelter meant survival. The technique spread rapidly across the frontier, not because it was new, but because it worked. Settlers who lacked this inherited knowledge, who tried to improvise or adapt methods from warmer climates, often did not survive their first winter. But raising the walls was only the first step. Even with precise notching, a stack of logs still had gaps. Wind seeped in, snow piled up inside, and vermin entered. The home had to be sealed, and this sealing process revealed the true engineering sophistication of the frontier cabin. Settlers used two components, chinking and daubing. Chinking served as the filler wooden wedges, stones, or oakum rammed into the larger gaps between logs. Daubing was the plaster that covered the chinking, creating a continuous, airtight seal on the exterior. Daubing was no simple mud. It was a biocomposite material, refined through trial and error to meet specific needs. Its base was clay mixed with sand, sometimes with lime added for strength. But clay alone cracked. Temperature changes caused the logs to expand and contract, so the daubing had to stay flexible without breaking. Settlers added binders like straw, moss, and animal hair to give the mixture tensile strength, and they also included fat. Animal fat, lard, or tallow from butchered livestock made the daubing waterproof. It repelled moisture, prevented ice buildup, and kept the seal intact through freeze-thaw cycles. This was materials science without labs, chemistry without schooling. The settlers who got this right survived, while those who didn't spent their winters fighting drafts and losing heat. Windows posed another problem. Glass was scarce and expensive, so settlers made do by stretching paper across window frames and coating it with animal fat until it turned translucent and waterproof. Others used animal bladders, scraped thin and dried, which let in faint light and caused minimal heat loss. Keeping warm mattered more than comfort. But the logs themselves provided natural insulation. Hardwoods like oak and chestnut were common in the eastern and midwestern regions. In northern forests, Early settlers preferred white cedar, fir, or pine, because these types of wood resisted rot and were easier to work with. Their density slowed heat transfer from inside to outside. With proper sealing and chinking, a log home could maintain an interior temperature far above the outdoors, even with a small fire. Managing the fire turned into a daily chore, and collecting firewood was hard and dangerous. Settlers were forced to venture into freezing forests, fell trees, haul them, and chop them into firewood, a massive physical undertaking. Igniting a fire proved equally difficult. It was possible to start a fire with flint and steel, but in sub-zero weather, with numb fingers and damp tinder, the process could stretch for several minutes or longer. No household dared allow the hearth to grow cold. So each night before bed, the father or eldest child would bank the fire. This meant gathering the hot coals into a tight heap and burying them under a heavy blanket of ash. The ash served as insulation, limiting oxygen and preserving heat. By morning, the coals were still hot. Tinder caught fire easily. The home stayed warm and the family got through. But if the banked fire failed, ash stirred up, or logs burned too quickly, the coals died out. When this happened, the family faced a serious emergency, and the only solution was to get fire from a nearby house. A child or adult would bundle up in multiple layers, hike through the bitter cold, often for several miles, and return with a metal pail of glowing coals. This custom contradicted the notion of self-reliant settlers. Frontier survival depended on helping one another. When the banked fire failed, it meant depending on neighbors. However, some settlers came up with a permanent solution. German immigrants in the Midwest built house barn structures that placed animal pens right next to or below the family's living quarters. The logic was biological. A cow, horse, or pig generates heat continuously. By bringing livestock inside the home's thermal envelope, settlers reduced the work required to collect and burn wood. The animals acted as passive heaters, providing reliable warmth without additional fuel. Later, in the 1900s, agricultural engineers would formalize this idea. They advised that dairy cow barns should be no wider than 34 feet to maximize the distribution of animal body heat without needing additional heating. Storing hay and straw in the loft above added another insulating layer, trapping warmth below, but living in close proximity to animals came with disadvantages. Diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, and others spread more easily when people and animals shared enclosed spaces. Settlers knew this risk but accepted it. During the bitter cold of a negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit winter, making it through the night mattered more than concerns about long-term sanitation. But there was another factor. The fireplace itself functioned as a thermal mass system. Settlers built fireplaces and chimneys from local stone or clay. These materials absorbed heat while the fire burned and released it back into the room after the flames died. Finding the right balance was essential. The chimney needed enough draft to safely expel smoke. Too much draft would pull warm air out of the house and replace it with cold outside air. The best fireplaces struck a middle ground, enough airflow to prevent smoke buildup, but not so much that the home lost heat faster than the fire could produce it. This was engineering by trial and error. Families adjusted, rebuilt, and refined until they hit on a workable design. Surviving the cold was only one challenge. Their isolation compelled settlers to stockpile enough supplies during summer and fall to last through the time when resupply was impossible. A bad harvest or flawed preservation technique meant going hungry before spring came. Pioneers built specialized structures to manage this risk. The root cellar was not simply a hole in the ground. It was a carefully engineered microclimate. Its goal was to maintain a stable temperature between 35 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity from 90% to 95%, preventing both heat-related rot and desiccation. This was achieved through careful design. The cellar was dug into the earth, using the soil as natural insulation. The temperature underground below the frost line remained fairly constant all year. The floor was packed dirt, which retained moisture and kept the air humid. Wooden shelves held root vegetables like potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions, spaced apart for airflow. Ventilation was critical. As fruits and vegetables aged, they released ethylene gas, which sped up ripening and spoilage. Settlers constructed ventilation shafts to remove this gas and regulate temperature. These ducts were simple, but they worked precisely. By controlling temperature, humidity, and air composition, the early settlers shaped the conditions that determined food shelf life. They didn't have modern chemistry, but they understood the results. A well-kept root cellar could keep vegetables fresh for months. In the coldest regions, settlers harvested ice. The work was brutal. When rivers and lakes formed ice at least 10 inches thick, teams of men ventured onto the frozen surface with saws and hooks. They cut blocks, each weighing several hundred pounds, and hauled them to the shore. From there, the blocks were moved to ice houses. The insulation slowed melting. Ice harvested in January could last into summer, providing below-freezing temperatures for dairy, fish, and meat. The people who did this job described it as exhausting and freezing, but it was essential. Without ice, perishable foods spoiled within a few days. Furthermore, storing meat required different techniques. Large game kills supplied plenty of protein, but only if the meat could be stored. Settlers picked up techniques from indigenous tribes. One method, shared by the Shoshone with trappers, involved cold smoking. Precision was required. A fire pit was dug about several yards from the smokehouse. An underground stone tunnel linked the pit to the smokehouse. The smoke traveled through the tunnel, losing heat as it went, and reached the smokehouse at a low temperature. This prevented the meat from being cooked. Instead, the smoke preserved it by leaving creosote and similar compounds that stopped bacterial growth and dried out the flesh. Meat that was correctly cold smoked could stay edible for up to 2 years. The difference from hot smoking, which cooks the meat and leads to quick spoilage, was significant. Pioneers who understood this distinction could survive, while those who did not lost their winter protein supply. Another method was potting. Jars were packed tightly with cooked meat, then covered with a thick layer of melted animal fat. Once it hardened, the fat formed an airtight seal that kept oxygen out and blocked microbes. This oxygen-free barrier prevented both oxidation and spoilage, allowing the meat to stay edible for weeks or even months when stored in cool, dry basements. The logic was simple. With no air, spoilage did not happen, but exactness was crucial. Even a small crack in the fat could break the seal, and these methods required a lot of upfront work. Settlers worked hardest during summer and fall, when the weather was tolerable, to prepare for times when tasks became impossible. They dug root cellars in frozen ground and harvested ice in freezing temperatures. Meat was butchered and smoked right after a hunt, no matter how inconvenient. The cruel irony of preparation was that the best time to rest was also the only chance to prepare. Hard work in warmer seasons gave extra safety during cold periods. The methods created by American settlers mirrored those of subarctic indigenous groups. In Alaska, the Yupik, Aleut, and Athabascan people built partially underground sod houses. These homes had frames made of timber or whalebone, covered with thick sod and soil. They used the ground's thermal insulation, similar to root cellars. The houses were small, with interior space typically under 10 square feet per person. Such cramped spaces meant that body heat and small oil lamps could warm the room enough. The core principles matched those of the frontier cabin: reduce air volume, maximize insulation, and seal every gap. Indigenous builders in Siberia and northern Canada used similar techniques. Their material choices differed. Bone replaced timber, snow stood in for sod, but the basic ideas were the same. Surviving in places where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees required specific architectural adjustments. The effective structures, whether built by European settlers or native peoples, arrived at the same solutions. And this was no coincidence. The subarctic demanded strict thermal requirements. Therefore, societies that met those requirements survived, while others vanished. The frontier cabin was not a European invention forced onto empty land. Rather, it was a blend. Scandinavian settlers brought interlocking log construction, a method perfected over thousands of years. Native communities contributed cold smoking techniques, storage pits, and knowledge about local resources. German immigrants introduced the combined house barn. Every group modified, experimented with, and improved methods under the constant pressure of the environment. Winter acted as a filter. Unsuccessful methods were eliminated. Successful methods quickly spread. The resulting cabin was not the product of a single culture but of practical mixing, the willingness to adopt any technique that improved survival odds. Yet this openness contradicted the myth of the lone pioneer. The American frontier is often portrayed as a test of self-reliance, where isolated families built a living through pure grit and endurance. The reality was more complex. Building a cabin required several families working together to lift and place heavy logs. The practice of sharing fire created unavoidable bonds. Collecting ice required teamwork. A person could be self-sufficient only because the community provided backup. Information was exchanged. Tools were borrowed. Hot coals were given freely. The idea of independence hid the fact that subsistence was a shared success. The traits shaped by frontier life were real, but they operated within a cooperative framework. A person's value was measured by his contributions to communal tasks, not by his ability to isolate himself. A frontiersman who would not help a neighbor build a cabin or refused to share embers in a crisis endangered himself. When his own methods failed, he would be left without help, and the harsh environment required mutual exchange. Staying alive was not an individual effort. Instead, it was a balance between personal skill and collective reliance, and the daubing needed regular reapplication. Logs expanded in summer heat and shrank in winter cold. Whenever gaps appeared, the wind found new paths. So each season, settlers inspected the walls, found flaws, and fixed them. The cabin was never finished. It was a dynamic system requiring constant care, and the work was tedious, exhausting, and endless. Yet that was the price of staying warm. A well-maintained cabin could last for decades, sheltering several generations, while a neglected one became unlivable in just a few years. Firewood had to be gathered, ice had to be collected, and meat required smoking. The root cellar needed oversight. All tasks were essential, demanding planning, effort, and precision. The settlers who made it through understood that getting through a winter at -40 degrees Fahrenheit wasn't a single heroic act. On the contrary, staying alive relied on countless minor, steady routines, keeping the fire going every night, checking the daubing each spring, cutting ice every January, and smoking meat each fall. Endurance was built gradually through daily practices, not through extraordinary happenings. The skills needed for these chores weren't innate but passed down. Because of thousands of years of ancestral tradition, Scandinavian colonists understood log notching. Cold smoking techniques from the Shoshone people were transmitted across many generations. German house barns contained centuries of farming knowledge for chilly environments. The frontier was never a clean slate. Rather, it was a crossroads where various knowledge systems came together, conflicted, and merged under severe strain. Successful settlers were the ones who identified useful methods from any source and quickly put them into use. This practical mindset applied to resource consumption. Everything was put to use. Fat from butchered animals made daubing water-resistant and sealed window openings. Animal hair strengthened clay. Bones served as structural parts or handles for tools. Animal skins served as bedding and to seal off drafts. Each piece of a slaughtered animal served various functions because limited resources compelled thriftiness. The frontier's economic system was naturally cyclical. Wasting materials posed a risk. Being inventive meant living. The log cabin was a lot more than just a basic refuge. This building showed humankind's capability to design solutions in the face of limitations. Those who constructed these cabins lacked industrial supplies, formal science training, and plentiful money. Their resources were only wood, clay, animal byproducts, and wisdom passed down. Using these, they built heat-holding envelopes that made indoor spaces survivable in regions where poorly prepared travelers frequently died. The cabin operated like a biological stone engine, fueled by fire and grease, sustained by uninterrupted toil. The log cabin didn't conquer the wild, it struck a bargain with it. The structure acknowledged the constraints set by weather and accessible supplies, working inside those boundaries. The settlers similarly recognized the need for ongoing effort and reliance on each other. The outcome wasn't mastery over nature, but living alongside it. Over centuries and across continents, in places where temperatures reached -40 degrees Fahrenheit, people have constructed homes that sustain them. Although materials and cultural contexts differ, the fundamental rules remain unchanged. Close every opening, hold on to each bit of warmth, get ready tirelessly during good weather, and exchange information and supplies when systems fail. The log cabin of the American frontier exemplified these universal requirements. It was not backward or rough. It represented an advanced reaction to a tough habitat fashioned by human beings. They comprehended that staying alive demanded intellect, flexibility, and the modesty to gain insights from those who had survived previously.